Now, one of the top items on David Cameron's agenda as Foreign Secretary will be relations with China. As Prime Minister, he presided over the so-called Golden Era, hosting a state visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping and welcoming investment from Beijing into the UK. But since then, relations between the two countries have deteriorated.
So what is he likely to do to rectify all of that? Let's go now to Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6. I mean, rather extraordinary appointment this morning. There's been a lot of debate in recent years. In fact, that big last leadership debate about who should be the leader of the Conservative Party and then become our Prime Minister, so much of that focused on who was tougher on China between Sunak and Truss. Now we've got a Foreign Secretary who, if anything, people accuse him of being pretty cosy with the Chinese government. What are your reactions?
Well, there's no question that his legacy in terms of relations with China is not something that impresses me or other critics of China. And I think we're in a position now where he will probably have to claim that given events in China, Xi Jinping's behavior, what's happened in the intervening period, he's revised his views. But, I mean, I do find it worrying that Cameron comes back. I mean, his appointment raises questions. It doesn't raise any answers. I mean, he didn't leave a glittering foreign policy legacy. He got two things desperately wrong. He got Brexit wrong and walked away. And he got relations with China wrong and walked away, despite, the strong advice. OK, I was shouting from the sidelines. I was long out of office by then. But our voice was dismissed. He didn't take any notice of the criticisms that we mounted.
Is that the kind of a guy he is then? Because clearly when we're dealing with Britain's relationship with China, it's a very important issue. I would suggest that the Prime Minister and now the Foreign Secretary should be talking to people like you and listening. Are you saying that he didn't?
Well, at the time, I, for example, was a strong critic of the whole issue of 5G and Huawei. I was a strong critic of the warmth with which we embraced the Chinese leadership. Because if you had had a longer-term view of China, if you had a longer-term view of what the rule of communist parties was like, and there seemed to be, a moment of illusion in the UK, particularly in business, that China had changed, that it wasn't run by the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, since then, we've had plenty of evidence now to make judgments and to have a more sensible attitude. However, I would say we're at a point where Biden is about to meet Xi, and clearly there's some effort with the US to reset their relations with China, presumably on a much more realistic and pragmatic footing. The Australians have gone down this track already. And maybe Cameron will be able to do this. And of course, personal relations are important. And one assumes he probably has got quite a good personal relationship with Xi Jinping. But you have to sup with the Chinese leadership with a very long spoon. And, we've had all sorts of things have happened since Cameron was in office, like the head of the security service standing up and saying publicly that China was the greatest threat to our national security. And I hope the new Foreign Secretary will take careful account of this and modify his views, modify his attitudes. But I don't think we should object to the idea that maybe we should look at our overall relationship with China and probably have it fixed on a more even and reasonable basis than we used to.
I mean, given that David Cameron is the director of something called One China, and he's just come back from a trip to Abu Dhabi where he's been promoting a Sri Lankan scheme, which is apparently part of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's been criticism about him when he was actually Prime Minister of selling off a lot of UK assets to the highest overseas bidders and being, frankly, too soft on Putin. Does it worry you that there may be this sort of shift back into what some people think of being historic myopia when it comes to so-called frenemies around the world?
Yeah, well, I already said that his appointment raises lots of questions. It's now up to him to try to provide answers to these questions in a manner which meets our expectations on British foreign policy. I mean, what worries me most is that we have a foreign secretary who has strongly remain implementing policy on Brexit at the very point we're beginning to see and harvest the benefits of Brexit. I mean, Rishi Sunak tonight, I think, is making a speech on foreign policy at the Mansion House. Maybe he's able to set out an agenda for Cameron that Cameron will now follow. But, you know, what worries me are the sort of closet remainers around, particularly in the civil service, in the Foreign Office. They'll be massively encouraged by Cameron's return. So, as I said, maybe we should be prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt and see what happens. But there are an awful lot of questions that are going to have to be answered effectively if he is going to follow what some of us believe was, as it were, the policy set by democratic choice of the British people.
Here's what worries me about Cameron back in this important office of state, Richard. It's this. You know, this guy on two fundamental, profound issues has been basically wrong. He completely misjudged the British public about Brexit and therefore, in the end, torpedoes his own career by his own mistake. And as you have indicated, he kind of got it wrong about China. He felt that if he could do his sort of old Etonian handshake and come on, let's be mates, everything would be okay. Well, that is to misjudge China. So we've got this guy back in a very important office. He is the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary of State, and he keeps making mistakes. Do you trust his judgment going forward?
Do I trust his judgment? Not at the moment. But I guess I'm the sort of person who might be prepared to give him a second chance. Look, as I said, his legacy on foreign policy was awful. Brexit, China, and to an extent, Russia. I mean, you could argue, you know, the red lines in Syria, he and Obama got all that desperately wrong. So, you know, his judgment was bad. The advice he got at the time was bad. We now have reset foreign policy. Global Britain is beginning to deliver. And we're in a completely different place. It's very odd to have a foreign secretary who followed a totally different foreign policy track. But maybe his, as it were, ability to leverage his contacts, unquestionably they're going to be good. He'll have certain advantages as foreign secretary. But what policy is going to follow? What will be the style, the accent of his decision-making, of his foreign policy judgments? I'm worried. I'm worried, but I'm a reasonable person, so perhaps he should have a second chance. There have been plenty of politicians who were vicars of Wakefield, and maybe he is exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, Sir Richard is someone that I massively respect and I think is very sound on almost everything in the world. It worries me that you're worried.
Yeah, me too.
It very much worries me you're worried. Rishi Sunak, having this cabinet reshuffle, one assumes to sort of reset his agenda for what could be his last year as Prime Minister. What do you think that he needs to be doing to make this country a safer place?
Well, we need to have a clear focus on national security issues. We need a clear focus in our defense policy. We need clear leadership. I mean, the irony of Suella Braverman's, what I would describe as political martyrdom, is that many people in the country instinctively would support the line that she took. I just don't quite see at the moment where the government's trying to position itself. And, you know, I'm getting quite long in the tooth myself, but, you know, one of the things that worried me about Cameron, and when Osborne was with him in office, was their inexperience about international affairs. And I think in Rishi, we clearly have a very able, capable Prime Minister. But who is advising him on foreign affairs? Who is advising him on issues of national security? We don't, as it were, define the country's position clearly enough. And I think that's what concerns me at the moment. I mean, I don't want to be apocalyptic, but we are going in a direction which is deeply worrying. And the other thing I would say is it looks as though, the Conservative Party is moving clearly to the centre. Politically, that might be the right thing to do. But look what's happening in Europe. The right in Europe, in many European countries, is coming to the fore. And, one needs to take account of the context in which the UK is operating. We still have massive soft influence and soft power. And in Europe in particular, we still have an important national security influence and position. And we need to be able to exercise that by being more confident, more clear, and more precise about our policies.
Can I ask you a last question, Richard? What should we do about these vast pro-Palestine marches that are happening in our major cities every weekend now? They estimate that maybe 300,000 were on that march on Saturday. I went to have a look at it. If nothing else, I can confirm it was absolutely massive. I can also confirm that while the atmosphere, it's not menacing, you don't feel threatened, but it is a mass demonstration of anti-Israel sentiments. The posters, the placards, some of them are frankly, blatantly, violently anti-Semitic. So we have mass law-breaking going on in our city centres every weekend. The police's policy is to stand back and let it happen. Suella Braverman suggested that we cannot continue to let this happen. What do you think we should do about these, what she called hate marches? They're certainly not peaceful in terms of their intent, in terms of Israel.
It's not an easy question to answer, but I would incline to the French solution. The French have banned these types of marches, and no one is suggesting that the French still don't respect their profound democratic traditions. And I would rather admire the fact that in France there has been an anti-Semitic march which was led by many prominent politicians and was a sort of public demonstration of what probably the majority of people in France feel, despite the very large size in France of the Muslim community, bigger than in the UK. But it seems to me here that I'm afraid that, people would argue, is it a Muslim influence? Is it human rights influence which inspires these marches? I don't think I need to explain that to our listeners. I think they know which it is. And, we have this compositional change in our society. That is still a very much minority view. And they should not be allowed to, as it were, through very intimidating social action, sort of push this highly sectional extremist influence in the way that it's being done. And I think the only answer to that is to ban those sorts of marches for a period of time, not necessarily indefinitely.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Richard Dearlove there.